We're about to enter the world of Greece, one of the most fascinating but also one of the most demanding units of this course. While European civilization owes a great deal to the ancient Near East, it is in Greece that the Western tradition really finds its roots. Today we're going to talk about what is sometimes called proto-Greek art, proto meaning first or before. Our art tour will take us first to the Cyclades Islands, then south to Crete, and finally north to the Peloponnesian Peninsula and the home of the Greeks of the Iliad and Odyssey, Mycenaean. So to what extent is this proto-Greek art a major departure from the art of the ancient Near East? And to what extent does it build on cultures that the seafaring people, the Minoans, would have known? Well, on the left, you see the goddess Neith from the tomb of Nefertari, and on the right, the famous Cretan La Parisienne. Note that these two paintings are only 100 years apart, and that the Minoan painting is actually slightly older. But basically, they're from the same era. So what similarities do you see? Both works show a profile view with a frontal eye. Both show composite figures. The colors are bright in both cases. Indeed, the paintings in Nefertari's tomb, like the Cretan paintings, were true fresco. What that means is that the artist painted quickly in wet plaster so that the paint would fuse with the plaster and prove much more durable. This contrasts with dry fresco, paint applied to walls that have already dried. Wet fresco was a rather late innovation in Egypt. Finally, both women appear to be wearing decorative clothing and probably jewelry. You'll hear the story of how La Parisienne got her name a little later, but what made a turn of the century French archaeologists think that this woman was somehow quintessentially European? What do you think? Well, her hair is stylish but more natural. You could imagine it actually blowing in the wind. She's animated. She even looks excited. This lady has got places to go and people to see. Here is a bull from the Babylonian Ishtar Gate next to the famous bull leaper fresco from Knossos. So what traits do they share? Well, I would say that both bulls display power and virility. They're both shown in profile with a frontal eye. If anything, I would say the Minoan bull is more stylized, less optical than the Babylonian bull. So how are they different? Well, again, it seems to me that the Minoan bull demonstrates much greater movement and vitality. Also, instead of simply symbolizing human power, it interacts with humans, this bull. And the Bull Leapers Act represents a different kind of daring, of individual spirit, of athleticism. The Ishtar bull celebrates the mighty king. The Minoan bulls celebrate human endeavor. They also played a critical role in Minoan mythology, as we'll hear in just a moment. The Lamassu and the Minotaur are both man-beasts. You're familiar with the Lamassu, which was a real favorite with last year's class. So before we compare these two works, let's hear the story of the Minotaur. And my apologies, this one should probably be rated R. So, now that you know the story, what difference is there, if any, in their legendary status, in their function as art, and or in their depiction? Well, the Lamassu is a guardian, again, representing both the power of the king and the king's status as a god. The Minotaur is a monster of partly human origin under the partial subjection of human beings. And indeed, his conquest is a story of human heroism. Welcome to Greece, which is all about the power of the human body and the human spirit. So how are these two works similar? Well, most obviously, they're both made of gold, although the so-called Mask of Agamemnon is hammered out of gold, or repoussé, the term for that, while Tut, from a richer civilization, is made of solider gold and contains precious stones as well, most notably lapis lazuli, that blue stone that you see. But materials aside, what similarities and differences do you see in these faces? Well, they're both death masks. But to me, at least, the Mycenaean king actually looks dead. He is also, again, at least to my eye, more individual in appearance, although we really don't have any way of knowing if he's just as much a physiological fake as Tut. We do know from Tut's mummy that he suffered from major deformities, probably genetic. You remember his very strange-looking daddy, Akhenaten, and that the Egyptian pharaohs tended to marry their sisters, producing genetic inbreeding and the problems that go with that. So, in summary, yes, there is continuity between the ancient Near East and the proto-Greeks, but yes, too, there is something new under the sun. And speaking of something new, I don't think I would be surprised to see these statues in the Museum of Modern Art. In fact, they're very, very sought after by collectors today, in part because they have such a modern vibe, and which is why, by the way, there is a booming art forgery market in Cycladic figures. You probably won't have any trouble recognizing Cycladic figures on the test, at least until you get to the 20th century. So what was the most common subject of these works? The answer, and yes, you will need to know this one, hint for the test, is a woman with arms crossed over her belly. Do you notice anything else about the belly? Well, it seems to be swelling a little bit. These may have been fertility goddesses. There are male Cycladic figures. Most appear to be playing musical instruments. And note that they, like most Greek statues, would have been garishly painted. These may have been funerary statues. Some were found in graves, but in fact, we don't know since they are prehistoric. Before I begin discussing the art of Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece, I want you to watch a video clip about the discovery of the sites we'll be looking at today, the Mycenae of Homer and maybe the Knossos of King Minos. So here we see the Palace of Knossos. I like this aerial view because it shows that the plan of the palace was indeed rather like a labyrinth, such as the labyrinth that allegedly held the Minotaur. It seems to have been a maze of large and small rooms organized around courtyards. By the way, there's actually some debate among historians about whether this was a palace or a governmental complex. It's quite likely it was like the Palace of Sargon II or the Apadana of Darius of Persepolis, a little bit of both. Here you see a reconstruction of the palace, really, of course, just an educated guess based on the archaeological finds. Notice the huge central courtyard, which might have been used for ceremonies or even for athletic games such as bull leaping. Here's the floor plan that you see in your book. Note again the huge central staircase. Do you remember from your textbook how the builders got light into this maze of rooms? Through interior light well staircases. How did the Egyptians get light into their temples? They used clerestory windows. Remember that term, it will show up again. So here you see one of those light-giving stairwells and also the characteristic Minoan column with capitals that really look like round, puffy chair cushions. The diagram compares the Minoan column to a Greek Doric column. Stay tuned, that's coming. The edges of the Doric column, you'll note, are straight, not curved. In the picture on the upper right, you get a glimpse of the spectacular frescoes on the wall. These frescoes are really the most famous elements of Minoan art and by far the most likely to show up on your AP exam. It's hard to capture buildings adequately on slides, which is why I like to use video. So let's return to our video for a tour through this palace. And back to the video again to see the discovery of the most famous room at Knossos. Here you see a reconstructed drawing, but actually they discovered quite a bit of this in the excavations. Of course, we don't really know that this was King Minos' throne or even that there really was a King Minos, but it's easy to see why Evans was so excited. Below you see another room from Knossos with even more spectacular frescoes. I actually took the term megaron off the vocabulary list since I've never seen it appear on an AP exam, but it means a reception room or a royal hall. I've already explained the difference between dry fresco and true or wet fresco. We're going to encounter much more fresco as we move through the course. As the video mentions, we don't really know the purpose of the huge courtyard at Knossos. By the way, I'm assuming you've already watched the video. But one theory is that it was the site of a spectacular religious ritual depicted here. I like the video's emphasis on the Greek regard for human endeavor, but let's also look at this fresco as a work of art. What conventions do you observe? This is a good opportunity, by the way, to practice using some of those descriptive terms. Well, the bodies are elongated to show movement, and the bull's legs, at least, are unnaturally slender and short. The men have dark curly hair and pinched-in waists. Notice, by the way, throughout this course, the different ways in which the human body is idealized. We tend to think of pinched-in waists as being more of a female idealization, but here it shows up in both men and women. The figures are shown in composite view, again with a frontal eye. By the way, if there were women in the painting, and there aren't, how would the men probably be portrayed? Well, generally in Minoan painting, they would be dark-skinned to distinguish them from light-skinned women. Basically, that's another convention. It's probably one of the reasons why La Parisienne looked European. It may reflect the view that men worked, played, and hunted and ruled outside in the light, while women stayed largely in the home. But art historians, for that matter, archaeologists and historians in general, think that women had a more prominent role in Minoan culture than most Greek culture. Other than goddesses, women don't get portrayed nearly as often in Greek art, and really even goddesses are not portrayed as often. This may reflect a different view of women's roles. We can't be entirely sure, but as you learn from your reading, there's at least some speculation that the Minoans were rather more egalitarian than the Greeks, who very much relegated women to hearth and home. I want to show you a few more Minoan frescoes that weren't in your book, partly because I think they're really vivid and interesting, and partly because you might be asked on the AP test to identify a work that you haven't seen as Minoan. The AP will do that. The College Board will do that to you sometimes, but when they pick a work like that, it's usually distinctive and relatively easy to identify. Here you see the dark-skinned men and the light-skinned women. Also note that Minoan women were often portrayed topless. Sea things were also common in Minoan art, which is not surprising considering that it was an island civilization. Archaeology, by the way, has revealed that the Minoans traded widely with both the ancient Near East and the Greek mainland. These frescoes are famous for their sense of movement and naturalism, although I'd note that the plants are still somewhat stylized. You'll recognize the maritime themes again on this chimerisware jar, but also notice the abstract geometric and curvilinear shapes, that is the wavy curved lines. And, to give you another vocabulary term, what would you guess that polychromatic means? Well, it means many-colored, something that shows many colors in light. Here again, note the sea creatures, the curvilinear lines, and the dark figures against a light background, which identifies this as later Minoan art. The first jar we saw had light figures against a dark background. Stay tuned for Greek vase painting. The snake goddess on the left is in your book. She is made of faience, or glazed earthenware sculpture. Do you remember that little Egyptian hippo? He was faience as well. Here you see some other Minoan faience snake goddess figurines. We actually don't know what purposes these served. Even the term goddess is just a guess. As the caption indicates, we also don't really know what this figure represents, but it was carved from hippopotamus tusk, I think that's kind of cool, and decorated with gold and rock crystal. The term for this mixture of materials is chryselephantine. Let me admit that this was an entirely new word to me. I actually took this one off the vocabulary list as well for the same reason. Never seen it on a test, but it is such a cool word that I really wanted to include it. So how does this relief sculpture differ from Egyptian relief sculpture? Well, there's a greater sense of movement and, says your textbook, perhaps the first ever to depict actual musculature. We'll see a lot more buff muscles as this unit progresses. The Greeks were into the body, and especially the male body. Notice too the busyness and the exuberance of the composition. No artist in Egypt would ever be able to get away with this. It's just too unruly, too passionate, too full of motion. Before we move on to the Mycenaeans, I'd like you to watch one last clip from this video focusing on the Minoans' fascination with the natural world. So you already saw a video describing Schliemann's discovery of Mycenae, the home of Achilles, Agamemnon, and other heroes of Homer's saga. This is one of the most famous Mycenaean sites, the citadel of Tiryns. So how does this differ from the Palace of Knossos, a palace that the Mycenaeans later conquered, by the way? Well, if Knossos and other Minoan sites were probably palaces, or at least administrative and religious centers, this is clearly a fortress, built by people who expect some enemies to come pouring over the ridge. Be sure that you can tell the difference between the labyrinthine Minoan courtyards, palaces, and this castle-like structure if you had to on an exam. Here's the citadel's floor plan. Again, notice the heavy walls and the central hearth. You still have a megaron or reception hall. A propylon is a gate, and Mycenaean art is especially famous for its gates. Okay, here are some terms you do need to know. Yes, some of these really will show up on your AP test. That's because they showed up on past AP tests. These openings are all designed to solve a basic problem. Well, what is it? The problem is, how do you stick in a door without the wall falling down? Simple as that. And post and lintel is, in fact, the simplest solution. It's what you see in Mesa Verde, for example. Triangular, corbelled, and true arches, because they can bear more weight, can use lighter materials by harnessing the power of geometry and opposing forces. By the way, we'll talk more about arches later when we get to Roman architecture and to Romanesque, that is medieval architecture. But for now, know these terms, and for this unit particularly, the corbelled arch. Actually, for Rome, you'll need to know the Roman arch as well. This is probably the single most famous Mycenaean image from a different Mycenaean site, possibly the capital city. The relieving triangle is just what it sounds like. It relieves pressure above the lintel, but it does it decoratively with a couple of impressive lions. This again is a corbelled arch. It's also a very, very famous image. Oops. The tholos, or beehive-shaped tomb, is another very characteristic Mycenaean structure. And this particular tomb had the tallest unsupported ceiling of any building until the Pantheon was built in Rome a lot later. Stay tuned. You'll learn a lot about domes in this course. A dromos is a long passageway through which you would approach the center of the tomb. These Mycenaean treasures are both examples of repoussé, or hammered gold pushed out in relief. We now know that this was not the mask of Agamemnon. It's too early, but the name is stuck. I included the bull because I really like it, and because once again we see a symbol of power, authority, and yes, virility. Here's another term you need. A crater is a wide cup with a handle, usually used to mix water with wine. We'll see more of these when we get to Greek vase painting. We also see further evidence that the Mycenaeans were a warlike culture. Whew, a lot of art in a day. Here's a summary slide that may help keep some of you straight. Help you keep some of it straight. I borrowed this from someone else and made some adaptations. At this point, your time may be up, but this last video clip, if you have time for it, gives you a good look at both the citadel of Tiryns and the ruins at Mycenae. If you don't get to it in class, you can find it on Moodle.